In the early stages of the Pacific War, the American forces encountered something they had never fully grasped: the Japanese concept of Bushido, the Warrior S Code. This code was absolute, demanding unquestioning loyalty to the emperor and emphasizing death over surrender. For the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not merely a defeat. It was the deepest possible shame, an act that brought dishonor to one's family and nation. This doctrine had a terrifying strategic consequence. Japanese soldiers would fight to the last man, leading to brutal, high-casualty battles across the Pacific Islands. But what happened when the war did end, and the soldiers refused to believe it? What happens when a man owes loyalty to an obsolete code forces him into a lifetime of jungle isolation? This is the story of the Japanese Zanryū Heishi, the holding out soldiers, who became the Ghost Battalion of the Pacific, and the bizarre, decades-long missions the U.S. and Japanese forces undertook to bring them home. When the Emperor announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, the news reached only the major command centers. On hundreds of tiny, forgotten islands across the Pacific, the Philippines, Guam, and Indonesia, thousands of Japanese soldiers remained isolated, cut off from all communication. They received no news of the surrender. If a single Allied plane dropped leaflets announcing the end of the war, the Japanese officers dismissed them as American propaganda, a deceptive trick to lure honorable men out of the jungle for execution. Their loyalty demanded they continue the war. They hid in deep cave networks, dug bunkers into the thick jungle, and reverted to absolute survival mode. They became ghosts, stealing food from local villages, wearing uniforms that rotted off their bodies, and maintaining the rigid hierarchy and discipline of a military unit even when reduced to just a handful of men. Their war was a perpetual Operation Hideout. For these soldiers, the war never ended. For the next 30 years, they remained convinced that the Emperor was preparing a counterattack and that their duty was to hold their ground. The world had moved on: jet planes, the Cold War, and the space race. But in the deep jungle, these men were still fighting a war of 1944. They performed reconnaissance, ambushed lumberjacks they mistook for enemy scouts, and suffered from disease, starvation, and the constant psychological pressure of isolation. The most famous of these holdouts was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda on Lubang Island in the Philippines. For nearly 3 decades, Onoda and his remaining squad evaded multiple search parties, both Filipino and Japanese. They dismissed old family letters and newspaper clippings as elaborate fakes created by the enemy. The missions to find them were extraordinary. Search teams played recordings of their wives' voices over loudspeakers. Helicopters dropped current Japanese newspapers and surrender documents. The soldiers refused to believe any of it. Their mental defense mechanism was absolute. Everything that contradicted the war was a lie. Lieutenant Onoda's personal war finally ended in 1974. A young Japanese traveler, Norio Suzuki, obsessed with finding the last holdouts, finally tracked Onoda down in the deep jungle. Onoda refused to surrender to Suzuki. He maintained that he could only accept an order from a superior officer. The Japanese government located Onoda's retired commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who now worked in a bookstore. Taniguchi flew to Lubang Island, found Onoda, and, wearing his old uniform, personally read him the official 1945 surrender order. Onoda formally surrendered his rifle, his sword, and his crumbling uniform after 29 years in the field. When he returned to Japan, the world treated him as a curiosity and a hero. The shame of surrender was replaced by respect for his impossible loyalty. His story highlighted the moral ambiguity of Bushido. Was his endurance an act of supreme loyalty, or the tragic result of a dangerous, outdated code? Onoda was not the last. As late as 1980, another holdout, Teruo Nakamura, was found in Indonesia. For these men, coming back to the modern world was the greatest shock. They had to learn about television, jets, and the peaceful democratic Japan that had replaced the imperial government they fought for. Their long, lonely war cost them their youth, their families, and their mental peace. It was a war fought against not an enemy army, but against time, reality, and the human need for contact. The story of the Ghost Battalion is a profound legacy of the Pacific War. It reminds us that victory is often followed by a complex aftermath of psychological trauma and unyielding conviction. These soldiers were extreme examples of a code that defined a generation, and their decades of isolation offer a chilling window into the immense power of military loyalty and unwavering belief. They were the men who refused to end the war, and whose ultimate sacrifice was their return to a world that had forgotten they ever existed. If you want to uncover more high-stakes stories of survival, psychological warfare, and the untold human cost of the Pacific War from the Pacific and Europe, hit that subscribe button.